June 6, 1944, 6:47 in the morning. Dalton Barrett is chest-deep in the Atlantic Ocean. The water is 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold enough to kill a man in 30 minutes if he stays still. Faster if he's bleeding. Faster still if he's wearing 68 pounds of gear and trying to move. Barrett is trying to move. His rifle is gone. Dropped somewhere in the 15 yards between the landing craft ramp and this exact spot where he's standing now with water up to his armpits and his fingers so numb, he can't feel the grenade still clipped to his harness. He should be running forward. Toward the beach. Toward cover. Toward anything that isn't this freezing kill zone where German machine guns are turning the surf red. He's not running forward. He's turned around. Facing back out to sea. Looking at Corporal Eddie Jenkins floating face down 20 feet away. Jenkins can't swim. Barrett knows this because they bunked together for 6 months at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, and Jenkins told him during a card game in March. Said it embarrassed him. Said he grew up in Pittsburgh, never had a pool, never learned. Barrett isn't a strong swimmer either. Learned in basic training. For weeks of doggy paddle and sidestroke in a concrete tank that smelled like chlorine and fear. The water at Camp McCoy was heated. This water is 48 degrees. Barrett's core body temperature has already dropped from 98.6 to 95 degrees. His legs are cramping. His thoughts are starting to slow. That's what hypothermia does. It starts at the edges. Fingers, toes. Then it moves inward. Toward the brain. Toward the decision-making center that right now is telling him something very simple. Go back. Nobody gave that order. There are no officers left to give orders. Lieutenant Caldwell is dead. Barrett watched him fall 8 minutes ago when the ramp dropped. Machine gun fire cut across his throat and he went down before his boots touched the water. Sergeant Morris is dead too. Took a round in the chest and sank like he was made of lead. Every man with stripes or bars is either dead or pinned down somewhere Barrett can't see. Which means nobody is in charge. Which means nobody can tell Barrett to go back into that water. Which means he has to decide. Jenkins is drowning. Barrett is here. The math is that simple. He drops his ammo belt. 23 more pounds into the ocean. Then he starts swimming. 7 months earlier, the draft notice came to a construction site in Seneca Falls, New York. Barrett was 24 years old. 5'9", 168 pounds. Vision 2020. The induction officer at Fort Dix wrote unremarkable on his assessment form. No college. No special skills. Labor battalion material. Barrett had been working construction since he was 19. Before that, odd jobs around town. He grew up in the kind of place where if something broke, you fixed it yourself because the nearest repairman was 20 miles away and charged more than your father made in a week. When he was 17, the volunteer fire department got called to the Henderson farm.
Baan 4.
The chief was late. Stuck behind a jackknifed truck on Route 20. The men who got there first didn't wait. They organized themselves. Water line. Ladder team. Evacuation protocol they'd practiced but never used for real. Barrett was the one who went into the barn for Henderson's dog. Nobody asked him to do that. Nobody was there to ask. The dog was in there and Barrett was the only one small enough to fit through the gap in the collapsed doorway. He got the dog out. Got himself out. The fire was suppressed in 23 minutes. No human casualties. The town record noted coordination excellent despite chief arriving 15 minutes after initial response. That was the culture Barrett came from. Figure out what needs doing. Do it. Don't wait for permission because by the time permission arrives, the barn's already gone. The Army tried to teach him different. In basic training at Camp McCoy, the drill instructors spent 12 weeks hammering one principle into every recruit. Wait for orders. Do not move until your NCO tells you to move. Do not think until your NCO tells you what to think. Barrett tried. He genuinely tried. But sometimes during field exercises, he'd see a problem. A gap in the line. A better approach to an objective. And he'd fix it. Move without asking. Adjust without permission. His drill sergeant wrote in his personnel file, Barrett tends to act before asking. Needs discipline. Recommend labor battalion. They sent him to the infantry anyway. Manpower shortage. They needed bodies more than they needed perfect soldiers. A company, 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division. The blue and gray, sons of the Confederacy and the Union, stitched together for a war across an ocean. They shipped out in April 1944. Troop transport to England. 40 days of waiting in camps that smelled like wet canvas and diesel fuel. Ration cuts during the crossing. Barrett's weight dropped from 168 to 152. Hollow cheeks. Loose uniform. On June 5th, he wrote a letter home. "Ma, we're going soon. Can't say where. I'm not scared exactly. Just hope I don't freeze up when it matters." Freeze up. He wrote those words 24 hours before he'd be standing in 48-degree water, frozen to the bone, swimming toward a drowning man. At 6:30 in the morning, the landing craft ramp drops. The sound is metal on metal. Hydraulic hiss. Then gunfire. MG-42 machine guns. German. Firing 1,200 rounds per minute. That's 20 rounds every second. The bullets hit the water and the men and the steel ramp with the same wet slapping sound. Lieutenant Caldwell goes down first. Barrett sees the spray of red from his neck. Sees him collapse into the surf. Sergeant Morris next. Chest shot. He doesn't make a sound. Just stops moving and sinks. The men behind them push forward anyway because there's nowhere else to go. You can't retreat back into the landing craft. The ramp is one way. Forward is the only option, even if forward means dying in the first 10 steps. Barrett makes it 15 yards. That's when he goes underwater. Foot catches on something. Submerged obstacle. He goes down. Swallows salt water. Comes up gasping. When his head breaks the surface, he can see the beach. 200 yards away. Might as well be 200 miles. Bodies everywhere. Some moving. Most not. The ones still alive are crawling toward a seawall at the back of the beach. A low ridge of stones. The only cover in sight. Barrett counts without meaning to. 6 men visible. Still moving. 20 bodies. Not moving. The math is simple and horrible. Then he sees Jenkins. Face down. Arms spread. Floating like a discarded coat 15 feet out from where Barrett is standing. Jenkins who can't swim. Jenkins who played poker with Barrett and lost every hand because he couldn't keep a straight face. Jenkins who showed Barrett a picture of his girl back in Pittsburgh and said he was going to marry her the day they got home. Jenkins is drowning. Barrett's body is already shutting down. Core temperature 95 degrees. Fingers numb. Legs cramping. The smart move is to get to the beach. Get to cover. Get out of this water before hypothermia takes him. Barrett doesn't make the smart move. He drops his rifle. 15 pounds into the ocean. Then his ammo belt. Another 8 pounds. Then he turns around and swims back. The first rescue takes 4 minutes. Jenkins is unconscious. 180 pounds of dead weight. Barrett gets behind him. Hooks his arm under Jenkins's chin. Side stroke. The technique they taught at Camp McCoy. One arm pulling. Legs kicking. The other arm holding Jenkins's head above water. For minutes to cover 20 feet. Barrett's core temperature is now 94 degrees. Moderate hypothermia. The symptoms are confusion, slurred speech, slow thinking. He gets Jenkins to the seawall. Drags him onto the stones. Jenkins coughs. Vomits water. Starts breathing. Barrett should stay there. Rest. Recover. Wait for the medics. He doesn't wait. He goes back into the water. Second rescue. Private Coleman. Leg wound. Shrapnel from a mortar round. He's conscious. Trying to swim with one leg. Going in circles. Barrett reaches him. Same technique. Arm under the chin. Side stroke. 165 pounds this time. Lighter than Jenkins, but Coleman is thrashing. Fighting. Panicked. Barrett takes an elbow to the face. Doesn't let go. Keeps pulling. 3 minutes to the seawall. Core temperature 93.8 degrees. Third rescue. Sergeant Davis. Not from a company. Barrett doesn't recognize him. Doesn't matter. He's in the water. He needs help. Davis is conscious. Helps kick. That makes it easier. 2 minutes instead of 4. But Barrett's body is failing now. The cold has moved past his fingers and toes. It's in his chest, in his lungs. Every breath feels like inhaling broken glass. Fourth rescue. The man's name is Walker. Barrett learns this later. Right now he's just another soldier. Another body in the water. Walker has a head wound. Blood in the water. He's semi-conscious, muttering something Barrett can't understand. For minutes, Barrett's stroke is sloppy now. Arms barely pulling. Legs barely kicking. Core temperature 93 degrees. Fifth rescue. Barrett doesn't remember this one clearly. The hypothermia has moved into his brain. Memory formation is impaired. Later, witnesses will tell him it was Private Henderson. 170 pounds. Unconscious. Took 5 minutes instead of 4 because Barrett kept stopping. Forgetting what he was doing. But he finished. Got Henderson to the wall. Sixth rescue. This one Barrett remembers. Young kid. Couldn't be more than 18. Gear still on. 70 pounds dragging him down. Barrett can see him sinking. Slowly. Like he's falling through molasses instead of water. Barrett's hands don't work anymore. Can't feel his fingers. Can't grip the kid's harness. Has to hook his arm through it. Loop it around like a lifeline. 6 minutes. The longest 6 minutes of his life. When they reach the seawall, Barrett collapses. Lies there on the stones. Can't move. Can't feel anything except cold. A medic appears. Face Barrett doesn't recognize. The medic is checking his pulse. Taking his temperature. The medic asks a question. Who ordered you to do that? Barrett's brain is too slow to process the question. Too cold to understand why it's being asked. Ordered. The word feels strange in his mouth. Nobody. They were drowning. The medic writes something in a log. Barrett will see that entry later. After the war. When he requests his medical file. The medic wrote, "This man needs psychiatric evaluation. Combat choc. Acting without orders. Possible mental breakdown." Barrett's core temperature when they finally got him to an aid station was 93.2 degrees. Severe hypothermia. 1 degree away from loss of consciousness. Weight. 147 pounds. Lost 5 pounds in 2 hours. Dehydration and energy expenditure. Nerve damage in his hands from the cold. Limited feeling for 3 weeks afterward. 6 men saved. Nobody gave the order. December 20th, 1944. 6 months later. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Captain Klaus Richter lowers his binoculars. He's been watching the American squad for 30 minutes. 12 men. Railway embankment. 200 meters across the clearing. Their lieutenant is dead. Richter saw him fall. Machine gun burst from the German MG-42 nest Richter's unit set up before dawn. The American officer went down and didn't get up. By every rule of warfare Richter learned at the infantry academy in Dobritz, those 12 Americans should be frozen now. Waiting for orders that won't come. Waiting for a new officer to be sent forward from the rear. They're not waiting. They're moving. 2 men have crawled into a drainage ditch. Disappeared from view. 3 others have shifted left where the embankment dips. They're firing into the woods on Richter's right flank now. Suppressing fire. Coordinated. A sergeant, Richter can see the stripes through his field glasses, is gesturing to a man with a Browning automatic rifle. The bar gunner moves to a new position. 20 meters away. Better angle on the German machine gun nest. Nobody is shouting. Nobody is using a radio. The lieutenant is still dead. And yet the squad is reorganizing itself into a flanking ambush aimed precisely at the position that just killed their officer. Richter turns to his runner. A 19-year-old named Karl.
Wer befehlt diesen Männern?
Who is commanding these men? Karl doesn't have an answer. Neither does Richter. But the question won't leave him. It follows him through the rest of the battle. Through the German retreat that afternoon. Through the long winter that's coming. Who is commanding these men? Richter is 4th-generation Prussian military. His grandfather served under Helmuth von Moltke the Elder. The man who invented Auftragstaktik, mission tactics, the greatest command innovation in military history. Tell a subordinate what to accomplish. Never tell him how. Trust him to figure out the rest. Richter was raised on those principles. Trained in them. Watched them conquer Poland in weeks. France in 40 days. Watched them push to the gates of Moscow. And now he's watching American soldiers, conscripts who 6 months ago were factory workers and farmers, execute those same principles better than the men who invented them. It doesn't make sense. Richter looks down at the field manual in his pocket. His grandfather's copy. Truppenführung. Troop Leadership. The 1933 edition. There's a note in the margin. His grandfather's handwriting. Initiative is the duty of every soldier. Richter thinks about the American lieutenant lying dead in the snow. Thinks about the 12 men who didn't stop fighting when he fell. Then he thinks about something else. Something the question implies but doesn't ask. If those Americans don't need orders to keep fighting, what does that mean for an army that spent 100 years teaching its soldiers that initiative comes from above? What happens when the men who invented the doctrine meet the men who live it without knowing its name? Richter doesn't have an answer yet. But 6 months ago, on a beach in Normandy, a construction worker from upstate New York swam into freezing water 6 times to save men nobody ordered him to save. That's where the answer starts. With a man who didn't wait for permission, because he'd never been taught that he needed it. October 14, 1806. A field outside the German town of Jena. Napoleon Bonaparte is destroying the Prussian army. 25,000 casualties in a single afternoon. The most drilled, most disciplined parade ground machine in Europe is being shattered by an enemy that refuses to fight by the rules. The Prussian officers have been trained to wait for orders. Napoleon's marshals have been trained to think. When the situation changes in front of a Prussian colonel, the colonel freezes. Sends a messenger back to headquarters. Waits for the king to tell him what to do. When the situation changes in front of a French marshal, the marshal acts. Adjusts. Improvises. Wins. 3 days after Jena, the fortress at Magdeburg surrenders without firing a shot. Not because it's been overrun. Not because it's out of ammunition. Because the commander can't get authorization from a king who no longer effectively exists. The Prussian officer corps sits in the wreckage of their army and makes one of the most consequential observations in the history of warfare. They have been trained to obey. Their enemy has been trained to decide. So they decide to copy what just killed them. In the 1860s, a general named Helmuth von Moltke the Elder takes command of the Prussian army. He's studied the problem. Read the reports. Talked to the survivors of Jena and a dozen smaller disasters where good soldiers lost because they were waiting for permission to win. Moltke writes a new doctrine. He calls it Auftragstaktik. Mission tactics. The principle is simple. War is chaos. The plan never survives contact with the enemy. The man at the highest level cannot possibly know what is happening at the lowest level fast enough to react. So you don't try. You give the man at the lowest level a clear understanding of why he's fighting and what his commander wants accomplished. Then you get out of his way and let him figure out how. Moltke's staff officers write it into training manuals, into academy curricula, into the very bones of how Prussia builds its military. There's a story every German cadet learns, passed down through generations. Prince Frederick Charles of Prussia is berating a major for committing a tactical error during a maneuver. The major protests, says he was only following orders. The prince replies, His Majesty made you a major because he believed you would know when not to obey his orders. That line becomes the heart of German military tradition, the opposite of the rigid heel-clicking robot soldier image that movies would later create. The real German doctrine says this: an order that no longer fits the situation in front of you is not binding. You are obligated to disregard it and accomplish what the order was intended to accomplish. By 1933, it's been codified into a manual called Truppenführung, Troop Leadership. The manual says, war is the realm of friction and uncertainty. The commander on the spot must be free to decide. Initiative is the duty of every officer and every NCO. Hesitation is a greater sin than a wrong decision actively taken. Back in the Ardennes, Captain Klaus Richter is still watching those 12 Americans. He's been watching for 35 minutes now. the longest 35 minutes of his military career. Richter entered the officer academy in 1927. He was 17 years old, son of a Prussian military family, grandson of a man who served under Moltke himself. He graduated in 1932, top 15% of his class, before the Nazi Party fully controlled the military, before Hitler started firing generals for showing initiative. Richter learned Auftragstaktik the way it was meant to be learned. Pure, undiluted. He used it in Poland in 1939. Watched his company commanders tear across the countryside making their own decisions about which roads to take, which bridges to seize, which Polish units to bypass. The campaign lasted 5 weeks. The doctrine worked perfectly. He used it in France in 1940. Watched junior officers improvise their way through the Ardennes forest, exploit gaps in the French line before headquarters even knew the gaps existed. France fell in 6 weeks. The doctrine worked perfectly. Then came Russia. 3 million German casualties between 1941 and 1943. The number is so large it stops meaning anything, until you understand what those 3 million represent. The men who die first in any army are the men who lead from the front. Auftragstaktik demands leaders who lead from the front, who go forward to read the situation, who expose themselves to see what needs to be done. So Auftragstaktik was killing its own practitioners. Every successful German company commander who went forward to assess the terrain got killed assessing the terrain, got replaced by a man who'd never been to the front before, who didn't have the experience to read the situation, who was therefore more likely to die or default to following whatever the manual said word for word. And then there was Hitler. In 1940, the Führer let his generals fight their own battles. By 1942, after the first reverses in Russia, that changed. By 1944, it inverted completely. Hitler personally controlled operational decisions down to the battalion level in some sectors. The infamous no withdrawal without my permission orders. The obsessive micromanagement. The firing of any general who showed independent judgment. Richter's own division commander was dismissed 3 times, recalled twice, finally sent to a desk job in Berlin where he couldn't cause trouble by thinking for himself. The trust at the heart of Auftragstaktik was broken. A German divisional commander in 1944 couldn't be confident his initiative would be rewarded. He could only be confident that a wrong call would end his career, possibly his life. The safer choice was always to wait for explicit orders from above. The doctrine still existed. The manual still said the same words. But the system had become the opposite of what the doctrine required. It had become Befehlstaktik, order tactics, the thing Auftragstaktik was designed to defeat. And now, in this frozen clearing in Belgium, Richter is watching American soldiers execute the doctrine his grandfather's generation invented. Execute it better than he can. The Americans aren't following Auftragstaktik. They've probably never heard the word. They're just doing it, because they don't know they're not supposed to, because nobody ever told them they needed permission to solve problems. Seneca Falls, New York. Summer 1936. Dalton Barrett is 17 years old. It's August. Drought summer. Everything dry as bone. The Henderson farm is 3 miles outside town. Dairy operation. 40 head of cattle. Barn built in 1889. The fire starts around 2 in the afternoon. Electrical short in the hayloft. By the time someone sees the smoke, the whole east side is burning. The volunteer fire department gets the call at 2:14 p.m. Chief Morrison is supposed to be first on scene. He's not. His truck is stuck behind a jackknifed semi on Route 20. Won't get clear for another 20 minutes. 6 other men arrive first. Farmers, shopkeepers, a mechanic, Barrett, who's been working a construction job nearby and hears the sirens. No chief, no orders, no clear chain of command. What happens next gets written up in the Seneca Falls town record. The men organize themselves. Water line from the pump to the barn. 3 men. Ladder team to the 2nd floor. 2 men. Evacuation of livestock. 1 man. Barrett sees Henderson's dog in the upper window. Howling. Trapped. The doorway to the loft has collapsed. Gap may be 18 inches wide. Too small for a grown man. Barrett is skinny. 5'9", 140 pounds. He doesn't ask permission. There's no one to ask. Chief Morrison is still stuck in traffic. Barrett goes through the gap. The heat inside is like opening an oven door. 160 degrees. Smoke so thick he can't see 3 feet. He crawls. Finds the dog by sound. Grabs it by the collar. Drags it back to the gap. Hands it through to the men outside. Then crawls back out himself. The fire is suppressed by 2:37 p.m. 23 minutes from first arrival. No human casualties. 1 dog saved. The town clerk writes, "Coordination excellent despite chief arriving 15 minutes after initial response. Nobody thinks it's remarkable. This is what volunteer fire departments do. Organize themselves. Solve problems. Don't wait for someone to tell them the building is burning. They can see that for themselves." Barrett goes back to his construction job the next day. Doesn't talk about the dog. Doesn't think of himself as brave. Just thinks the dog needed help. I was there. What else was I going to do? From 1938 to 1943, Barrett works construction. 5 years. Different crews. Same pattern. The foreman on most jobs is a man named Paulson. Good at bidding. Terrible at showing up. Has a drinking problem everybody knows about but nobody talks about. On a good week, Paulson is on site 3 days out of 5. On a bad week, 1 day. The crew of 6 learns to run jobs themselves. Barrett's specialty becomes problem-solving with whatever materials are lying around. Bridge form collapses on a Friday. Cement delivery scheduled for Monday morning. Can't reschedule. Can't afford the delay. Barrett rigs a temporary support system from scrap lumber over the weekend. Holds long enough for the pour. Structure passes inspection. Another time, crane breaks down. Part won't arrive for a week. They need to lift a steel beam today or the whole schedule collapses. Barrett designs a pulley system using rope and the truck's winch. Takes 4 hours. Works perfectly. The crew completes 18 projects between 1940 and 1943. 16 finish on time or early. The 2 that don't are the ones where Paulson actually showed up and interfered. This is the culture Barrett comes from. Adults absent or incompetent. Figure it out yourself. Problem with no obvious solution? Use what's available. Nobody giving orders? That's fine. You can see what needs doing. Then the draft notice arrives. October 1943. Barrett reports to Fort Dix. Gets issued a uniform. Gets told to wait for orders before moving. The Army tries to teach him different. 12 weeks of basic training. The message drilled into every recruit. Do not think. Your NCO will think for you. Do not move. Your NCO will tell you when to move. Barrett tries to follow the rules. But during field exercises, he keeps seeing problems. Gaps in the line. Better approaches to objectives. And his instinct, the instinct built over 17 years in Seneca Falls, is to fix them. He moves without asking. Adjusts without permission. His drill sergeant writes in his file, Barrett tends to act before asking. Needs discipline. Recommend labor battalion. The Army sends him to the infantry anyway. Manpower shortage. The flaw that should have disqualified him becomes the thing that saves 6 men's lives on Omaha Beach. July 1944. Normandy. 3 weeks after D-Day. The hedgerow country. Bocage. Every field is a separate fortress. Earth banks 4 feet high. Hedges and trees growing 15 feet tall on top. Root systems 3 to 12 feet deep. When a Sherman tank tries to climb over one of these banks, the tank's belly exposes itself to whatever's on the other side. The Sherman's belly armor is thin. Thinnest part of the vehicle. A German Panzerfaust team in the next field can destroy the tank by simply waiting for the underside to tilt up toward them. First week of July, 47 Sherman tanks destroyed in hedgerow combat. 34 from belly hits. The official engineering solution requires factory production. 6 weeks minimum, maybe 8. Men are dying now. Sergeant Garrett Cullen is 29 years old. Liquor sales assistant from Cranford, New Jersey, before the war. No engineering background. quiet manner, habit of listening to other men's complaints without interrupting. There's a brainstorming session in his tank battalion. Officers and NCOs sitting around trying to solve the hedgerow problem. Someone from Tennessee, Robert's a loader, says half-jokingly, "Why don't we just weld saw teeth on the front and cut through the damn things?" Most of the men laugh. Cullen doesn't. He goes to Omaha Beach. The invasion beaches are still covered in obstacles. Check hedgehogs. Steel anti-invasion barriers shaped like jacks. Thousands of them. Cullen cuts sections of steel from the hedgehogs, brings them back to his unit, finds a welder in the engineer battalion, trades a bottle of confiscated German schnapps for 3 nights of the man's time. Cullen works after dark, cuts steel into prongs, welds them onto the bow of a Sherman tank. July 14th, he invites his battalion commander to watch a demonstration. The Sherman accelerates to 10 miles an hour, hits a hedgerow bank, drives through it, not over it, through it. Belly stays level, protected. The battalion commander calls General Omar Bradley. Bradley arrives the next day, watches the demo himself. His order: mass produce immediately. Within 11 days, 500 Rhino devices are welded onto American tanks. Sherman losses in hedgerow combat drop 73%. A liquor salesman with a welding torch solved a problem that the entire Allied Engineering Corps had been throwing resources at for 3 weeks. August 1944. German POW interrogation. Somewhere in France. The interrogator is American. Captain. Intelligence Corps. The prisoner is German. Major. Panzer Regiment. Standard questions. Unit strength. Officer names. Supply routes. Then the German major asks a question of his own. How is your sergeant allowed to modify equipment without orders from the engineering corps? The American interrogator looks confused. What do you mean, allowed? It worked, didn't it? The German major stares at him. In our army, a sergeant who modified a tank without authorization would be court-martialed. The American captain shrugs. In our army, a sergeant who solves a problem gets a commendation. The interrogator writes this exchange in his report. Thinks it's interesting. Doesn't realize it's the key to the entire war. The Germans built a doctrine that said soldiers should take initiative. The Americans built a culture that assumed soldiers would take initiative. Doctrine can be taught. Culture can't. Doctrine requires permission from above. Culture doesn't ask permission. Dalton Barrett didn't need Auftragstactic to tell him to swim back into 48-degree water. He just saw men drowning and decided that he was the one who had to do something about it. Garrett Cullen didn't need a manual on decentralized innovation. He just saw tanks dying and figured out how to stop it with scrap metal and a welder. They were doing what they'd been doing since they were 17 years old. Solving problems. Without waiting for someone to tell them they were allowed to. That was the system. Except it wasn't a system. It was a country full of volunteer fire departments and construction crews with absent foremen and kids who organized their own baseball games without an adult in sight. It was 200 years of American culture that said, if something needs doing and you're there, you don't need permission. You just do it. The Germans had spent 140 years trying to teach their soldiers to think like that. The Americans had been raised that way from birth. And in the winter of 1944, that difference was about to decide a battle in a place called Bastogne. December 16, 1944. 18 hours after the German offensive breaks through. Dalton Barrett's regiment is loaded onto trucks in the middle of the night. Nobody tells them where they're going. Just move. Now. The 116th Infantry hasn't had time to recover from the Ardennes fighting. Barrett's squad is down to 9 men. They were supposed to be in reserve, resting, refitting. Instead, they're driving through freezing rain toward a town none of them have heard of. Bastogne, a road junction in Belgium, population 4,000, sits at the center of 7 highways radiating out like spokes on a wheel. If the Germans take Bastogne, they take the roads. If they take the roads, they can push all the way to Antwerp, split the Allied armies in half, maybe win the war. Barrett's convoy arrives at 0400 hours. December 17th. Dark, cold, Confusion everywhere. The 101st Airborne is supposed to be defending the town. But their commanding general is in the United States. Their assistant commander got diverted to another crisis. The man in charge is Brigadier General Thurman Oakes, artillery commander. Never commanded a division in combat before. Oakes looks at a map for 15 minutes, identifies the road hub, makes a decision. We hold this town, no matter what. He doesn't ask permission from anyone higher up. Doesn't wait for orders from Supreme Headquarters. Just looks at the situation and decides what needs to happen. Then he gets out of the way of his battalion commanders, who get out of the way of their company commanders, who get out of the way of their platoon leaders, who get out of the way of their sergeants. The men actually deciding which foxholes to dig, which tree lines to defend, when to call in artillery, when to hold fire because the figures coming through the snow might be Americans returning from a forward position. December 22nd. 6 days into the siege. 3 German corps have surrounded Bastogne. 45,000 men against the 11,000 Americans inside the perimeter. For German soldiers walk into the American lines under a white flag. They're carrying a written ultimatum. The note is typed, formal, addresses the American commander with all proper military courtesy. It demands the honorable surrender of Bastogne within 2 hours. Warns of total artillery annihilation if the Americans refuse. The German officers who delivered it wait for a reply. The note gets passed up the chain. Company commander to battalion commander to division staff. It reaches General Oakes around 1,130 hours. He reads it. According to the men present, he says almost to himself, "Oh, nuts." Then he asks his staff how he should reply. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Ward suggests that his first reaction was pretty good. Oakes writes the official reply on a piece of paper. It says in its entirety, "To the German commander, nuts, the American commander." The Germans don't understand. The American officer who delivers the reply has to explain that nuts is, in this context, an emphatic refusal. The German officers look confused. In their army, surrender negotiations follow protocol, formal channels, proper diplomatic language approved by regulations that go back to the Franco-Prussian War. They have never encountered a reply like this, written by a brigadier general acting on his own authority with no consultation of higher headquarters in language not approved by any military regulation in any army on earth. They've encountered the American command system at full power. One word. No permission. Pure improvisation. December 23rd. Barrett Sector. Southeast Perimeter. Tree line overlooking open ground. Barrett's squad sergeant is killed by a sniper around 0900 hours. Clean headshot. Dead before he hits the ground. Standard procedure. Call for a replacement NCO. Wait for someone to be sent forward from the company CP. The squad doesn't do that. They hold an election. Corporal Morrison gets 4 votes. Private Davis gets 2. Barrett gets 3. Morrison becomes acting squad leader by democratic consensus. First thing he does is ask Barrett to take point position. "You got a reputation," Morrison says. "Omaha. Men listen to you." Barrett doesn't want the responsibility. But he takes it anyway, because someone has to. The next 3 days are a blur. For German probes on their sector. Small unit attacks testing for weak points. The squad repels all 4. Not because they have superior firepower. Not because they have better positions. Because they keep adjusting. Keep improvising. Keep making decisions on their own without waiting for Morrison to tell them what to do. On the 3rd probe, Barrett sees 2 Germans trying to flank through a drainage ditch. Same tactic he used at Omaha. He knows how it works. He gestures to Davis. Points. Davis nods. Shifts position without a word. When the Germans emerge from the ditch, Davis is waiting. The probe collapses. Later that night, Morrison asks Barrett how he knew they were coming. Barrett shrugs. Drainage ditch was the move I'd make. Figured they'd make it too. Morrison writes in his log. Barrett thinks like the enemy. Good instinct. What Morrison doesn't write. Barrett isn't following doctrine. He's just solving problems the same way he solved barn fires and bridge forms and drowning men in 48-degree water. See the problem. Fix it. Don't wait for permission. December 26th. Patton's Third Army breaks through to Bastogne. The siege is over. The Germans pull back. Barrett's squad has held their sector for 9 days. Lost 2 men. Killed or captured an estimated 40 Germans. Nobody asked them to vote for their own leader. Nobody authorized their improvised tactics. Nobody signed off on their decisions. They just did what needed doing. Because that's what American soldiers do. May 1945. Trent Park, North London. The war in Europe is over. Germany has surrendered. British intelligence is going through recordings. 15,000 hours of secret conversations between captured German generals who didn't know their rooms were bugged. The transcripts run to 150,000 pages. Most of it is tactical. Discussions of battles. Complaints about supplies. Arguments about strategy. But scattered through those pages are conversations that cut deeper. November 1944.
Lieutenant General Werner Krebs.
Captured in Tunisia. Held at Trent Park since 1943. He's talking to another general about the American soldiers he interrogated before his capture. The transcript reads, "I cannot understand them. They argue with each other. Make jokes about their officers. No discipline in the German sense. Yet, on the battlefield, they fight with an instinct for the situation I have never seen in conscripts. How do they do this? They are freer. They do not wait for permission." December 1944.
Panzer Commander Heinrich Stolz.
Describing an engagement in Normandy where 4 American tanks, no officer, just a sergeant in the lead vehicle, outmaneuvered his entire company. "They made decisions faster than my men could observe them. Not better trained. Not braver. But they do not wait. This is the difference." Late 1944.
General Franz Dietrich.
The most devastating admission of all. "We have taught our officers to think and our soldiers to follow. 100 years of this doctrine. The Americans broke this rule. They are winning because they broke it. The American soldier does not need permission. He was raised in a country that never taught him to wait." The British intelligence officers reading these transcripts don't fully understand what they're seeing. They think it's just tactical analysis. Losers making excuses. They don't realize it's something else. It's the sound of a military tradition that conquered most of Europe, trying to explain why it lost to factory workers and farmers who'd been in uniform for less than 2 years. The Germans knew exactly why they were losing. They just couldn't fix it. Because you can't teach culture. You can only be raised in it. November 1945. The White House. President Truman awards the Medal of Honor. The citation reads, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, Private Dalton Barrett, on June 6, 1944, voluntarily and repeatedly entered hostile fire and frigid water to rescue 6 wounded men from drowning. Despite severe hypothermia and complete absence of command structure, Private Barrett continued his actions until physical collapse. His selfless valor exemplifies the highest traditions of military service. Barrett stands at attention, 26 years old now, discharged 2 months ago, weight back up to 163 pounds. The medal feels heavy around his neck. Afterward, a reporter asks the question that has followed Barrett since Omaha. "Private Barrett, what made you go back into the water?" Barrett looks at the reporter like the question doesn't make sense. "Made me? Nobody made me, sir. Jenkins was drowning. I was there. What else was I gonna do?" The reporter writes this down. Thinks it's modesty. False humility. Doesn't understand that Barrett genuinely cannot comprehend the question. What made you assume someone made him? Gave an order. Provided authorization. The possibility that he needed authorization never occurred to Barrett. Jenkins was drowning. Barrett could swim. The math was that simple. That disconnect between the question and Barrett's answer is the entire war in miniature. December 20th, 1944. Back to the clearing in the Ardennes. Captain Klaus Richter is still watching those 12 Americans. He's been watching for 40 minutes now. Their lieutenant has been dead for 40 minutes. And they're still fighting, still coordinating, still executing a flanking maneuver that would make a Prussian staff officer proud. Richter looks down at the field manual in his pocket. His grandfather's copy of Truppenführung. There's a note in the margin. His grandfather's handwriting from before Richter was born. Initiative is the duty of every soldier. The doctrine is perfect. The words are correct. But the Americans across that clearing aren't following the doctrine because they've read it and understood it. They're following it because they don't know they're not supposed to. Because nobody ever told them they needed permission to solve problems. Richter realizes something in that moment. The German army spent 140 years writing doctrine to create soldiers who could think for themselves. The Americans spent 200 years building a country that assumed everyone could think for themselves. Doctrine versus culture. Theory versus practice. Permission versus assumption. The Germans lost before the first shot was fired. Not because their doctrine was wrong, but because doctrine can only take you as far as the culture beneath it allows. And the culture beneath the German army, despite 140 years of trying, still believed that initiative came from above. The culture beneath the American army believed that initiative came from the man on the spot. Richter lowers his binoculars. His runner Karl is still waiting for an answer.
Wer befehlt diesen Männern?
Who is commanding these men? Richter has an answer now. He's been watching it for 40 minutes.
Alle. Keiner.
Beide. Everyone. No one. Both. The man on the left of the sergeant and the man on the right of the sergeant and the sergeant himself and the private with the bar and the rifleman in the drainage ditch and the wounded man propping himself up to keep firing. None of them outrank the others in any way that matters. All of them outrank the situation. That's the secret the Germans never broke. Because there was nothing to break. There was no code, no system, no doctrine you could steal or copy or defeat. Just 12 men who'd been raised in a country that never taught them how to wait. Dalton Barrett returned to Seneca Falls in September 1945. Worked construction. Became a foreman in 1946. Retired in 1982. He attended the funerals of 3 of the 6 men he pulled from the water at Omaha. Spoke at 2 of them. Didn't talk about the beach. Talked about the men. Their families. The lives they lived after the war. He died in 1989, age 70. The funeral was attended by 200 people, including Eddie Jenkins, who flew in from Pittsburgh, who'd been unconscious that day in the water and didn't remember being saved, but knew he'd been saved, and knew who saved him. Jenkins gave the eulogy, said the thing Barrett would never say about himself. He didn't wait for permission to be brave. He just was. Klaus Richter survived the war, became a professor of military history at the University of Hamburg, published a paper in 1967 titled Cultural Foundations of American Small Unit Initiative, never mentioned the Ardennes clearing, never identified himself as the captain who asked the question. But the paper's conclusion is one sentence. Doctrine cannot teach what culture already knows. Garrett Kuehlen returned to Cranford, New Jersey, went back to liquor sales. The Army offered him the patent for the Rhino tank device. He declined. When asked why, he said, "Wasn't my idea. Roberts suggested it. I just did the welding." He died in 1963, age 48, heart attack. The tank prototype he built is preserved at the Patton Museum, Fort Knox, Kentucky. Label reads, Kuehlen device. Invented by Sergeant Garrett Kuehlen, July 1944. Barrett's Medal of Honor is at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Next to it is a letter. Eddie Jenkins to Barrett, 1946. You saved my life and you'll say it was nothing. That's what makes it everything. Barrett's rifle, the one he dropped in 48-degree water on June 6, 1944, was never recovered. Army wrote it off as lost in action. Probably still buried somewhere in the sand at Omaha Beach. A piece of steel that a construction worker from upstate New York decided he didn't need if it meant the difference between reaching a drowning man or not. Captain Richter asked, "Who commands these men?" The answer the Germans couldn't accept. The man who saw what needed doing and did it. Not because he was ordered. Because he was there. You can write doctrine for 140 years. You can create the most sophisticated command philosophy in military history. You can conquer Poland and France and push to Moscow. But you can't write the culture that produces a 25-year-old construction worker who drops his rifle and swims back into freezing water 6 times to save men nobody ordered him to save. That comes from somewhere else. From volunteer fire departments and absent foremen and kids who organize their own baseball games. From 2 centuries of American culture that said, if something needs doing and you're standing there, you don't need permission. You're already in charge. The Germans invented mission tactics. The Americans were mission tactics. That was the difference. That's why 12 men in a frozen clearing could fight without their lieutenant. That's why Bastogne held. That's why the answer to who's in charge was always the same. Everyone. And no one. And the man standing right there when it mattered most.